The coffee shop had been loud just a second ago, clattering cups, grinding beans, the murmur of morning conversations, but when the little girl looked up at him with those wide, steady eyes, everything inside Mark Turner seemed to shatter into a ringing, impossible silence. He had just stood to leave, pulled by the familiar impulse to run from anything that felt too close, too warm, too much like the life he'd lost. But her words drifted across the small space between them, soft yet sharp enough to stop him mid-step. "You look like my daddy should." The sentence hit him like a forgotten photograph falling out of an old book, unexpected, haunting, and full of a past he never spoke of. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in stories that remind us of the good still left in people, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need it today, and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly helps us keep making stories from the heart. Mark sat back down slowly, feeling the weight of the world pressing onto his shoulders. He hadn't planned on sitting anywhere that morning. He had intended to grab a plain black coffee to go, as he did almost every day, avoiding any place where families gathered. But something had nudged him into this small café on the corner of a quiet street in Denver, Colorado, something he couldn't name, a feeling more than a thought. And now here he was, sitting across from a woman who looked more startled than he felt and a little girl who seemed too perceptive for her age. Her name was Sophie. He had heard the woman, her mother, call her that just moments earlier. Sophie had been coloring on the paper placemat, swinging her legs beneath the chair, humming softly. Mark had smiled at the innocence of it. The mother, whose name he later learned was Claire, had been sipping her coffee with a tired grace, as though mornings were both the hardest part of her day and her only moment of calm. Mark hadn't spoken to either of them before the little girl's words, but Claire had noticed the change in him immediately. Something had flickered across his face, pain, surprise, something deeper, and she had straightened in her seat as if preparing to apologize on her daughter's behalf. But Sophie hadn't looked away from him. She had stared at him like she could see something inside him even he didn't dare look at anymore. Mark Turner wasn't the kind of man who shared his story. Not with strangers, not with friends, not even with the mirror. He had once been a father, once been someone's whole world. But that was before the accident, before the night that rewrote the rest of his life in a way he had never wanted. He had walked away physically unharmed, yet carrying an emptiness so unbearable that he had abandoned everything else, including his marriage, including hope. He moved across the state, took up a small job repairing bicycles, and stayed quiet, living in the kind of solitude that felt like punishment. But Sophie didn't know any of that. She simply saw something in him, something she needed, or something she missed, and she said so with the raw innocence only a child can wield. As Mark settled back into the seat, Claire reached out and placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder, as though trying to shield her from what might come next. But Mark only gave a small, almost broken smile. He didn't know why he stayed. Maybe because it had been years since anyone, especially a child, looked at him with something other than passing indifference. Maybe because he felt the strange stirring of a feeling he had shut away long ago. For a few minutes, the three of them sat there in a quiet that felt oddly comforting. Sophie returned to her coloring, glancing up every once in a while with a thoughtful little frown, as though trying to understand him. Claire continued watching him with a cautious curiosity, sensing something heavy behind his calm exterior. Mark had never been good at small talk, the words always felt too thin. But sitting there, he found himself offering pieces of himself he hadn't given anyone in years. He spoke about small things at first, the weather, the coffee, the bicycle shop he worked at on the east side of the city. Claire told him she was a nurse working long shifts at a senior care center, raising Sophie mostly on her own since her divorce 2 years earlier. There was a quiet strength to her, a resilience softened by moments of vulnerability she didn't try to hide. Sophie, sensing the adults warming to each other, chimed in every so often with observations only a child could think were crucial, how her favorite color changed every week, how she wanted a puppy, how she liked that Mark had kind eyes. Each comment loosened something in him, untangling knots he had grown used to carrying. Still, there was an ache beneath all of it, a ghost lingering in every breath he took. Claire could sense it. She didn't ask about it, she didn't push. But she did something Mark had long forgotten people knew how to do, she listened without expecting anything in return. The conversation drifted into deeper waters naturally. Mark found words spilling out of him, words he had kept locked away. He told them he used to have a daughter named Grace, that she had been the same age Sophie was now. He told them he hadn't seen her in almost 5 years, not since the accident that had changed everything. His voice trembled, but he kept going. And when he finished, he stared down at the table, expecting the familiar recoil, the quiet tightening people did when grief became too real. But neither Claire nor Sophie moved away. Sophie reached out first, placing her tiny hand on top of his. The gesture was so gentle, so instinctively kind, that Mark felt tears sting the corners of his eyes. Claire's own gaze softened, filled not with pity but with understanding. She didn't try to fix his pain, she simply shared the space with him, letting the moment breathe. Something inside Mark cracked open then, a dam he didn't know still existed. He had been drowning quietly for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to come up for air. The café around them faded, the chatter became background noise. What remained was this little circle of unlikely connection, a moment formed by fate or chance, he wasn't sure which. But it was real, and it was changing him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The morning sun shifted across the window, landing on Sophie's curls, making them glow like threads of gold. Mark found himself smiling, not the tight, polite smile he gave to strangers, but a real smile, one that carried warmth he hadn't felt in years. They stayed like that for almost an hour. Talking. Sharing. Healing without saying the word out loud. When Claire finally stood to leave, she hesitated before speaking. She thanked him, not in the casual way people thank someone for holding a door, but in a way that felt sincere, meaningful. As if meeting him mattered. As if she felt that same quiet shift in the world that he did. And Sophie, before taking her mother's hand, looked up at him one last time and whispered, "I think you're supposed to smile more." It was such a simple thing. Yet it was the moment he knew he would never forget. Days passed before Mark saw them again. But he thought about them constantly, about Sophie's bravery in speaking truth without fear, about Claire's quiet strength. He wondered if life was giving him a chance to step out of the shadows he had lived in for too long. And then one afternoon, as he was locking up the bicycle shop, he saw them standing on the sidewalk across the street, Sophie waving wildly, Claire smiling as though she was genuinely glad to see him again. It felt like the universe answering a question he hadn't dared to ask. From that day on, their paths intertwined naturally. Coffee became a weekly ritual. Conversations grew deeper. Trust built itself gently, carefully, like a fragile bridge stretching toward something new. Mark found himself laughing again, helping Sophie with little projects, listening to Claire share her dreams for the future. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, healing threaded its way back into his life. He began reaching out to his ex-wife. He began writing letters to Grace. He didn't know if she would ever want to know him again, but for the first time, he hoped she might. Claire and Sophie didn't replace the family he lost, they simply reminded him he still had the capacity to love, to give, to live. They reminded him he was still human. If this story has touched your heart at any point, please take a moment to like, comment, and share this video. Your engagement helps more people find these stories and keeps this channel alive. Before we end, I have a special request. Comment below what part of the story moved you the most. Mark never expected a single sentence spoken in a cafe to change him. But sometimes, God sends reminders in soft voices, voices that say things our hearts have forgotten how to hear. And for Mark Turner, it all began the moment a little girl looked up at him and said, "You look like my daddy should."